Number 10, men's time of the month. Ancient Egypt was plagued with diseases. While the Egyptians were actually pretty advanced in terms of their medical sciences and cures for said diseases, there were still a bunch that people had no defense for. In particular, schistosomiasis infected nearly everyone at the time. This is an illness that makes people feel sick and causes our red to appear often in the toilet. It was actually so common that they didn't even realize it was a disease. Ancient Egyptians got schistosomiasis so often that they just thought it was a natural part of growing up. They accepted that men had to menstruate just like women do, and they accepted the red vino on tap coming out of their bodies was a normal part of growing up. Number 9. Kinda rude. In ancient Egypt, those born with dwarfism were actually well accepted in society. Their recorded daily activities suggest assimilation into daily life, and their disorder was not shown as a physical handicap. Wisdom writings and moral teachings in ancient Egypt commanded respect for dwarves and other individuals with disabilities. But one thing I read online suggested that if you were born with dwarfism, you certainly did not have to worry about unemployment. Usually, this is because in ancient Egypt, little people were often hired to work in security-sensitive jobs, specifically those who worked with gold. This didn't actually apply only to those with dwarfism, but others with obvious physical characteristics that helped them stand out. These people were considered to be the best candidates for this kind of work because if a worker stole anything, they were very easily found and promptly arrested. Number 8, me and all my friends. Every time a First Dynasty king bit the dust back in ancient Egypt, a whole lot of people went with him. Egyptians were famously almost more obsessed with their lives after they passed on than they were with their actual lives, and a passed away king needed his retinue to support him in the afterlife. It was a shocking show of power. For example, almost 600 other people were found buried with King Jur. When a king went, hundreds went with him, but those who were taken out this way would not necessarily feel that they were being unceremoniously taken. Those servants who were sent to bite the dust and be buried with their masters were considered privileged to be allowed to follow a powerful figure into the afterlife to serve them. However, it was still likely nerve-wracking to know that your fate was tied to the random passing of a person that you worked for. Egyptian royalty stopped this practice early in the First Dynasty, but it may have continued in a more innocent form, with the Egyptians burying mummies with little carved figurines that could magically serve the deceased in the afterlife. Number 7, sunburn. In ancient Egypt, one of the most awful crimes that you could commit was any form of offense or disrespect toward the sun god. If you vandalized or robbed a temple, committed any form of personal disrespect, or were otherwise found guilty of any offense related to the sun god, you were usually sentenced to be set on fire. This punishment was only reserved for the greatest of offenses and was usually accompanied by a ritual that committed the act to the gods. While the ancient Egyptians rarely practiced actual sacrifices, this was one of the few exceptions. While burning is painful enough to begin with, it was considered the most horrific way to go of all the ancient Egyptians because of the ritual significance of the act. They believed strongly in preserving the physical body for life after passing, and believed that destroying the person's physical body completely by burning would leave them with no vessel in the afterlife. Now, while the gods could still technically intervene to help this person out, it was about as terrifying a punishment as a believer in ancient Egyptian society could imagine. Number 6, sandwich paper. Okay, so this moment isn't actually from ancient Egypt, but it has to do with ancient Egypt, and it is pretty disturbing. There was a time in the early 1900s when anything involving ancient Egypt was considered a fad. Mummies were imported to Europe to be unwrapped at parties, and many mummies were illegally smuggled out of ancient Egypt. The truth is, there were a lot of mummies around, and no one really felt much respect for them. Even at the time, very little proper historical significance was attributed to them. For this reason, getting hold of mummy bandages was not only cheap, but in some cases, cheaper than paper. An enterprising businessman in the United States decided that he could save some money making wrapping paper for food, and imported some old brown mummy paper to do the trick. Unfortunately for him, his plan failed when people started catching cholera, and the use of mummy paper to wrap food was promptly abandoned when it shouldn't have even started in the first place.
Number 5, exile. Exile as a form of punishment was applied in ancient Egypt for certain offenses. It involved banishing an individual from their community or region as a means of punishment and deterrent. Exile was one of the various punitive measures used in the legal systems of ancient Egypt. Exile served as several purposes in ancient Egypt, including punishment, deterrence, and the maintenance of social order. It was viewed as a way to remove individuals who had violated societal norms or committed offenses from the immediate community. The duration of the exile could vary, as some individuals might permanently be banished from their community, while others might face a specific time period of exile which they could actually return. But if you didn't have a calendar on you, it might be a bit tough for you to figure out when you were supposed to come back. Number 4. Retribution. Retribution in ancient Egypt was a concept embedded in the legal and social framework, particularly in cases of serious crimes such as death. Retribution was closely tied to the principles of justice, divine order, as we mentioned earlier, which is ma'at, the belief that the balance and harmony needed to be maintained in the universe. In cases of these killings, the principle of retribution was often applied. Family members of the victim might even have a say in determining the fate of the offender, sometimes seeking revenge or just accepting compensation. This compensation might also involve the offender providing goods, money, or other assets to the victim's family as a means of seeking forgiveness and restoring balance. Retribution was seen as a way of maintaining ma'at, which encompasses the concept of truth, justice, and cosmic balance. Offenses against ma'at, particularly heinous crimes like killings, were believed to be upset the divine order and required corrective measures to restore harmony. Number 3. Corporal punishment. Like in all the ones listed above, there's one thing you need to know, and that there are no lawyers in ancient Egypt. A suspect was interrogated by the police, and the judge in court and witness were brought to testify for or against the accused. Since the prevailing belief that a person who had been charged was guilty until proven innocent, witnesses were often beaten to make sure that they were telling the truth. Once one has been charged with a crime, even if one was finally found innocent, one's name was still kept on record as having been a suspect. As such, public disgrace seems to have been a great deterrent as any other punishment. Even one that were completely exonerated of all wrongdoing, one would still be known as the community as a former suspect, so it's still sus. Corporal punishment such as whipping or beating was administered for these certain crimes, and the severity of the physical punishment might correspond to the seriousness of the offense. Number 2. Capital punishment. Law asserted its autonomy as early as the age of the pyramids, whereas the role of religion in legal matters began to diminish. Religion then no longer determined the legal standing of a matter, but it was rather a judicial mechanism which became authoritative, even in the religious sphere. Capital punishment, including execution, was reserved for the most severe crimes such as killing somebody. The methods of execution would include hanging, drowning, or other forms of judicial killings. Against most of these really depend on the severity of these crimes. And finally, of course, number 1, which is the death penalty. I mean, obviously, if you kill someone, you're met in the court of law based on which country you're in, and if you're in Canada, if you commit manslaughter, you might have to face, in the level of seriousness, up to 10 years. In the US, it's up to 25, but of course, in the prison systems vary and depends on what the clause was, as well as on good behavior and then parole. But in ancient Egypt, they appreciated the sanctity of life and respected it, which made them use the death penalty in order to not violate the sanctity, so the divide between killing and manslaughter, as an example, had to be made in order to preserve the non-violation of the death penalty. The death penalty was more for intentional killings and even resulted to psychological sanctions that were viewed more severe than execution. For example, if a parent killed their young, the body of the killer was then tied to the corpse of the victim for 3 days until the moment of decomposition, all while under the protection of guards and burning alive for young killings of their parents. It was also more of a warning to anyone who threatened to kill anyone, and even given the option that if you committed death on yourself and take your own life was apparently a gift granted to those who are sentenced to death.
Number 10. Hathor. The goddess Hathor was originally created by her dad, Ra, as a destroyer of men. She was supposed to punish all those who were disobedient to him, but then Ra was like, nah, I don't really like that idea. He just kind of changed his mind and decided to make her the exact opposite, instead the goddess of love. But she kind of loved killing men, and like even he couldn't stop her. So one night he gave her what was supposed to be a mug of ale, but actually made it like a special kind of blood, and she got so drunk off of it that she got too tired out to kill anymore and therefore became the goddess of love. Drunk in love, am I right? Her cult was centered in Dendera, where she was also seen as the goddess of fertility and childbirth. When the Greeks occupied Egypt, they compared her with the goddess Aphrodite. But unlike the voluptuous woman Aphrodite was depicted as, Hathor came in 3 forms, and I bet you can't guess which. She was depicted as either a woman with a cow's ears, wearing the headdress of a cow, or just a cow. Moo. Number 9, the beginning of the world. What an inventive way to imagine the beginning of things. I mean, the Big Bang is still pretty crazy too, but hey, here we go. Freaking love how much magic is in these stories, like I'm in, because that's all there was at the beginning of the universe according to the ancient Egyptians. Just swirling darkness, chaos, and magic. Heka, the god of magic, was the only thing that existed, waiting for the opportune moment to begin. Then a hill showed up called Ben Ben, and out of which the god Atum erupted from. He was lonely, so he mated with his own shadow to give birth to two children, Shu and Tefnut. Shu gave life, Tefnut gave order. They left their father to build the world, but they were gone so long he took out his eye and sent it to search for them. In the meantime, he just kinda sat there, contemplating eternity, all alone. He was really sad. This guy sounds like Zeus mixed with Eeyore. Anyways, his kids came back and he was so happy he wept tears of joy, and out of which were born men and women. They also brought his eye back, so that was nice. Number 8. Light as a feather. So unlike a lot of religions we've heard of, there wasn't really a concept of hell in Egyptian mythology. It was either you were worthy of heading into the afterlife or you weren't. Maachi was the goddess of harmony and supported the belief that if harmony was disrupted, it must be restored. Every ancient Egyptian myth in some form follows this format. But the most important role she played was in the afterlife. When the soul left the body, it would appear in the Hall of Truth in order to stand judgment before Osiris. The heart would be weighed on a golden scale against Maachi's white feather. If the heart was heavier, it would be devoured by a monster and the soul would disappear. If it was lighter, then you could go live in eternal bliss. So instead of several layers of burning torment, souls in Egypt instead faced eternal darkness and unconsciousness. The idea of non-existence was more terrifying than being cut up by demons. Number 7. Osiris and Isis. Okay, so we aren't strangers to deities being a fan of incest. It was kind of like how they multiplied, and ancient Greeks were okay with it, kind of, but they kind of weren't. Anyways, the Egyptian gods were no exception. Isis and Osiris were two of the 4 children of the goddess of Nut. Isis and Osiris were married and actually really in love. They dug each other. When Osiris rose to the throne as the eldest sibling, his brother Set was pretty jealous. So he took the life of his own brother, cut him into little pieces, and scattered them all over Egypt. He really wanted to make sure the guy was dead. But then Isis wasn't someone you wanted to mess with. She had great magical powers capable of restoring life. She collected all of the pieces of her brother/husband and breathed life back into him. Osiris returned to life and they made all the love and then soon conceived a child named Horus. However, Osiris couldn't return to the land of the living, so he had to stay and rule over the underworld. So his son Horus was left to get revenge, and we'll get to that later. Number 6. Anubis. Now, I think in Western films that depict ancient Egypt, like The Mummy Returns, the god Anubis is often associated with the underworld. You know, that creepy half-man, half-jackal creature who appears to walk out of your nightmares? He's so creepy. Well, he did used to run the underworld until Osiris took over, but he was actually the god of mummification and the afterlife. So, not wrong, but not the whole story. Anubis was the son of Nephthys and Set. Well, kind of. Nephthys actually never conceived the child with Set. She kind of had the hots for Osiris. So she disguised herself as Isis and made love to him that way, and then Anubis came to life. That may have been one of the reasons Seth attacked Osiris in the first place, as his suspicions rose. But it was actually Anubis who helped Isis piece together Osiris, creating the first mummy. Fun fact, during the Greek rule of Egypt, Anubis and Hermes were seen kind of as the same, the people who ferried the dead to the underworld. Oh, sorry, and a point. Anubis was actually the one who weighed people's hearts, so he used the feather, the thing, you know what to do. He was responsible for doing that.
Number 5. Luxor Tomb. We've been saying 2,500 years ago, and don't get me wrong, that's an awful long time to go. But in 2014, archaeologists discovered a 4,000-year-old tomb from the 11th dynasty, tucked away in Luxor, Egypt, of course, as this list says. Spanish archaeologists found a tomb belonging to a leader from the 11th dynasty, and it's pretty obvious that this was somebody from the royal family or somebody who was a high-ranking official, because at the time, Luxor was the capital city of ancient Egypt, and officials also believed this tomb could have been used as a mass grave. The important thing to note here is that the tomb had also been used during the 17th dynasty, because tools and utensils from that later time were also found in this grave. We're gonna find a spork in 5,000 years and be like, ah yes, ancient tools, interesting. Number 4. 210 sarcophagi. So we thought it was a pretty big deal when 160 bodies were recently discovered in Egypt. This was back in September 2020. Over 160 coffins were found. wild, right? Well, those are rookie numbers, turns out. For this one, archaeologists found 210 sarcophagi near Queen Nefertiti's funerary temple in the city of the dead, Saqqara. Yeah, there were over 160, surprise. Maybe next time you check in with us, that number will be even higher. Who knows? Hopefully, / maybe hopefully not. I don't know how I feel about this. This was January 2021. We probably would have seen it on the news, but that was when 768 people were storming the Capitol, so the news was a bit busy, I guess. Thanks. These sealed coffins were untouched for thousands of years. They went from finding 160 to finding 210. That's incredible. According to the ministry, the sarcophagi were completely closed and haven't been opened since they were buried at all. They opened a few though, of course, just to analyze and display them, but that's it. Yeah, leave the rest. I'm not focused on ancient curses or Brennan Fraser having to come out and save the day. Just let dead people lay where they are. Let them rest. The amount of effort gone into hiding and preserving their memory alone, I mean, look how long it's taken for us to even find these things. It's almost like they didn't want to be found. Number 3, the ancient curse. The walls of some of these tombs have warnings from the gods, which is a lot. One of them warning trespassers that the gods will wring their neck like that of a goose. Also, if I walked into somebody's property now and it said trespassers' necks will be wrung out like a goose, I would turn back. I wouldn't want to investigate further. I would just walk away. You don't need to be an ancient god to get that message across, you know what I mean? But inside the found tomb of the vizier Enkamor, a pharaoh's official from 4,000 years ago, a curse was written. Buried in a mastaba, an above ground massive tomb, was this warning. Might do against this, my tomb, the same shall be done to your property. It also warns of the vizier's knowledge of secret spells and magic, and threatens to fill impure intruders with a fear of seeing a ghost. Yeah, there's that, or beware of dog. I don't know, you can pick which is more impactful on your property, sure. Number 2, the animal tombs. This tomb was found, as you may have guessed, in the Valley of the Kings. You're getting good, nice. But this one doesn't sound like the rest. I mean, for starters, it's a number rather than a name. What in the Elon Musk is happening here? Whose name was a number, huh? KV52 was discovered in 1906 by Edward Ayrton. Tomb KV50, KV51, and this one, KV52, they all form a group referred to as the animal tombs. Underneath 6 feet of debris, the entrance to these vaults were found, so when we enter this tomb, specifically KV52, that's been untouched, ideally for thousands of years, we can look forward to finding anything. In fact, whatever we do find, it's a win. It helps complete this age-long puzzle. So when officials opened KV52 and it was completely empty, well, that doesn't feel too nice. Something here is wrong. It was empty except for 2 boxes. Both were black and undecorated, which is odd considering what we've learned on this list. The larger of the 2 contained the remains of a monkey, and the smaller one was a canopic chest that had 4 compartments in it. Hauntingly bare compared to what else we've seen on this list, but it gets a little better. We're not done yet. Finally, number 1, Queen Nefertiti's hidden chamber. When researchers are 90% sure about something, that's a pretty good sign. You only say you're 90% sure of something when you know for sure. You leave 10% in case anything else goes wrong out of your control, right? 90%, that's confident, we got this. So when Egyptian authorities said they're 90% sure there's a hidden chamber in King Tut's tomb, well, we got a little jazzed. Got some jazz hands going on. Not gold, jazz hands. Back in 2015, a paper was published on the burial of Queen Nefertiti. Archaeologist Nicholas Reeves argued that while conducting scans on the ancient site, Reeves found what resembled traces of doors beneath the plaster. Now, it's been considered previously by archaeologists that King Tut's mask, having ear piercings and all, suggests that at that time, that tomb and that death mask was actually meant for Queen Nefertiti, not King Tut. But because King Tut died suddenly when he was 19, plans had to quickly change. 90% sure is good enough for me. What do you guys think? Comment down below all your thoughts.
Number 10, Tutankhamun. This guy is arguably the most famous Egyptian pharaoh. So what is he doing at the top of the list? Well, King Tut wasn't famous for anything he really did in his lifetime. I mean, he was a young pharaoh, but someone on this list was technically pharaoh since he was 2. No, he wasn't famous for anything he really did. Instead, Tutankhamun's tomb, discovered in 1922, was one of the greatest archaeological discoveries ever. It was almost entirely intact, and his sarcophagus was incredible. Tutankhamun only lived to the age of 20, and how he lost the spark of life is actually still a mystery. He may not have done much other than a lot of religious reforms, but he managed to find another way of living forever. Number 9, Jojor. So, with King Tut, he didn't really do much in his short lifetime. With Jojor, we actually don't really know a lot of what he did. Also, like Tutankhamun, it was what he did for and after his departure from life that made him famous. Jojor was responsible for the construction of the limestone step pyramid at Saqqara, the first of its kind. It was a huge architectural achievement. A building that stays structurally sound no matter how big it gets? Well, knock me down and call me Susan. The pyramid was actually completed after he lost the will to live by his official Imhotep. Number 8. Amenhotep III. Okay, on to the members of the list who we know did something significant for Egypt during their time on the earth. Amenhotep III ruled an artistically and financially successful Egypt. He had pretty stellar reviews on Google for his trade relations, which boosted up the economy of Egypt, but it was his artistic side that got him a bit more of a lasting recognition. He is the pharaoh with the most statues of himself. He created tons of monuments and a lot of stone scarabs that still hold up with tons of stories of historical events. I want some statues myself. Is that weird? Probably. Number 7. Hatshepsut. Now look, women in Egypt had high status and were respected more than in other parts of the world at the time. But a female pharaoh, while not unheard of, was unfortunately still pretty rare. Hatshepsut here was known as the most successful of those female pharaohs. Her father, King Thutmose I, wanted her to inherit the throne, and to that end, she was brought up learning how to lead. She reigned for 21 years after the death of her husband, and everything she did, from tons of construction projects to creating trade routes, went off without a single hitch. The people of Egypt lived in peace for her entire rule. Number 6. Thutmose III. Thutmose III was, surprisingly, the son of Thutmose II, who was the husband of Hatshepsut. You know, number 7, the most successful female pharaoh. So that's the kind of cloth we're working with here. Thutmose was only 2 when his father bit the dust, so while he was technically the next pharaoh, his stepmother took over with him as co-ruler. This guy's contributions to the Egyptians were tremendous though. He was literally called the Napoleon of Egypt, which shouldn't Napoleon be the Thutmose III of France? Either way, Thutmose III. He helped expand Egypt like none before. He was a dope warrior and he helped in the construction of a lot of stuff. Most importantly, the Temple of Karnak. That's how you make mama proud. Number 5. Forced confession. In ancient Egypt, they had a well put together system of laws and a group that essentially acted as police. But that doesn't mean things were really all that fair. Just like in older European societies, forced confessions out of people was incredibly common. In fact, it was basically standard practice. Usually to elicit confessions, people would be whacked with sticks, often on the bottom of the feet. Those who were forced into confessing were expected to not only admit to what they did, but explain where anything they stole might still be hidden and rat out every single one of their accomplices. Then, the same practice could be applied to those accomplices. Unfortunately, like many imperfect legal systems, it will never be possible to quantify just how many innocent people may have been punished for a crime because they were forced into confessing, something that they didn't do. Sadly, false confessions under this method are an incredibly common phenomenon because people will do almost anything to just make it stop. Number 4, just leave her alone. When a man passed away in ancient Egypt, he was embalmed right away. Women, on the other hand, were a different matter. By law, the beautiful and the powerful weren't sent to embalmers until they had been in the afterlife for 3 to 4 days. This was all because nobody trusted the embalmers. This wasn't just paranoia though. It was something that the Egyptians learned the hard way. An embalmer left in charge of mummifying a royal body was caught in the act by a co-worker. We learned this from the following passage in Herodotus, which you can take with a grain of salt if you want to, but it went like this. Quote, "The wives of men of rank when they pass are not given at once to the embalmed, nor such women as are very beautiful or of greater regard than others, but on the 3rd or 4th day after their passing, and not before, they are delivered to the embalmers. They do so about this matter in order that the embalmers may not..." I'll just leave the rest up to your own imagination. Number 3, crocodile dung. The ancient Egyptians were the first society we know of to create birth control. However, this birth control was not in the form of pills or little rubber things. Instead, the Egyptians turned to crocodiles, specifically their rear ends. To avoid pregnancy, the ancient Egyptians mixed honey and crocodile dung and then inserted that lovely mixture into the holiest of holies before any of the fun began. The reason for this is possibly that the acidity of crocodile poopy is considered to be effective at eliminating a man's microscopic soldiers of fortune. That is the best way I could have said that. Number 2, Hippopus. Surprisingly little is known about the life of the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun, but some historians believe they know how he got a ticket to the afterlife. Scans of the young king's body show that he was embalmed without his heart or his chest wall. This drastic departure from traditional Egyptian burial practices could suggest many different things, but one hypothesis is that he may have suffered a horrific injury prior to his passing. According to a handful of Egyptologists, one of the most likely causes for this wound would have been a bite from a hippopotamus. Now, I don't know if you know, but hippos are actually extremely dangerous. But evidence indicates that the Egyptians hunted the beasts for sport, and statues found in King Tut's tomb even depict him in the act of throwing a harpoon. If the boy pharaoh was indeed fond of stalking the dangerous game, then the end of his life might have been the result of a hunt gone wrong. And finally, in at number 1 today, kitty shield. It's no secret that ancient Egyptians were obsessed with cats, and even worshipped them. When a cat lays down to its eternal rest, every member of the mourning family would shave their eyebrows in sorrow. If someone took the life of a cat, they were thrown into a poisonous snake pit. Rightly so. After a cat passed on, it was mummified and buried in the cat cemetery with a bowl of milk next to it to prevent them from being thirsty in the afterlife. They also trained them to be vicious exterminators of pests that infiltrated food storage, allowing an agricultural society to dominate the Mediterranean. This was great. I love cats too, but it may have actually been part of the reason the Egyptians suffered a horrible defeat. Cats were so precious that when the Persians showed up using cats as shields, the Egyptians retreated in fear of taking the life of a cat. So the Persians took out tons of soldiers, the pharaoh, and took over the rule of Egypt.
Ma'at is the goddess of justice, as she and her scale balance between one's heart and a feather, and if yours weighed more than the feather, then you were met with the dark afterlife. But if your heart was equal to the feather, you would continue your journey into the afterlife. As for the principles of Ma'at, she had 42 laws that of the ancient Egyptians would follow if most, as there were other tribes as well who had their own following, had a specific distinction in society. Most, if not all, were pretty reasonable, but one in one of their 42 rules was a little odd. The rule was, I have not felt sorrow without reason. The rest of the rules were pretty great, as it includes I made no one cry today, I have not stolen food from a child, I have not stolen anyone's land, I have not polluted the water. Those are pretty great rules, but the not have felt sorrow without reason does borderline on the whole mental health set of things. Unless you're melancholy all the time, the concept of mental health was still a foreign concept, and even now, there are still people who do not believe it to be a rational feeling. As times go on, in this law in particular perhaps was not only referencing to the sake of ancient Egyptian mental health, but if someone was feeling depression or anxious or just not normal, they might have been ostracized or even looked with disdain. Number 9, fines. I mean, the concept of fines came pretty prevalent in these times, especially if theft and burglary occurred, which, as we know, grave robbing was pretty common. With that being said, the court had no power to ensure the judgment was fulfilled and instead actually relied on social pressure. The guilt had to be admitted and the judgment would be accepted. Oracles of the gods could also be approached to judge cases, so the assailant or the assumed accused, the penalty for stealing the property of individuals was up to paying a fine of 2 or 3 times the stolen object, which sounds pretty decent or very present in regarding of current times. As for theft of public property, however, as an example, the thief would be told to pay up to 180 times the amount of the stolen goods, or goods in general. The accused would be ordered to return the stolen goods after his full confession, which, by the way, as we understand in some cases, are beaten out of them, and they would be subjected to be beaten again, anyway, by 100 strokes by hand and swearing an oath, or thrown into a river for crocodiles to eat, and the sentence would be sentence in full public display for everyone to see. Number 8, bribery clause. If you were caught bribing, especially if you were in state administrative work, you would be 100% brought to trial and punished. And by punished by dismissal from office, and your status would just be turned into a farmer. Bribery played a negative role in crippling the entire administrative process to the point where the government clerks would steal a file approving the conviction of one of the accused from the judicial archives. Many criminals, like thieves and grave robbers of the tomb of a king during a reign of Ramsey IX, were freed after paying said bribe. So even if the laws in ancient Egypt were pretty intense and a strict notion of punishment of being caught, it seems like if you were in a high political office and you were caught bribing, not much would happen to you and you would be sent to court as an equal punishment like that of a civilian. You would just be turned into a civilian. Just like seeing a politician who runs for political office and them losing and then seeing them at Walmart the next day. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. but it's not a surprise someone in high positions would just get a slap on the wrist, or even in this case just a demotion. Number 7. Infidelity. Like in most societies, adultery or infidelity has always been looked down on. In ancient Egypt, adultery was considered a religious crime. The death penalty was also looked into this as used to prevent the spread of immortality in society. In the teachings of Ptah, he warns not to be fascinated by women and be careful from approaching women, as that's why thousands of men were perished. It's because of women's fault. When it comes to adultery with married women, it was a crime of deserving death, as it is easier to commit any other sin after that, so you can't commit another crime if you're dead, and if the crime is caused by a married woman, then her husband has the legal right to forgive or punish his wife, or just leave it to the court to punish the wife with no proof. The punishment of the man, who was a lot more lighter than the women of the ancient Egyptians, felt the offense of a promiscuous woman was more of her fault. While the women would be suffering several deaths, the men would just suffer severe beatings, and including the Ma'at's 42 laws, it is also mentioned, "I have not seduced anyone's wife" on the list, but if you do seduce, you are met with punishment. Just like the other way around on seducing husbands, just like Mae West once said, "Why don't you find a single one and leave the husbands alone?" Number 6. Penalty for treason. In life and all of human history, nothing is more vile than treason. Treason of one's family, one's friendships, treason to your nation, and even treason to yourself. But in ancient Egyptian times and law, when it comes to treason, it was met with one and only option, and that was death, execution style. And this was the only imposed penalty regarding the social status of the accused, especially if the majority of the defendants were close to the king. When King Ramsey III chose an heir to his throne, and this created a jealousy amongst his wives, especially a middle-class wife called T, who plotted to assassinate him to make her son the king. The wife and all the conspirators were caught, prosecuted, and punished, and considering there were no cemeteries for anyone to commit a crime against the majesties, the bodies would just be thrown into the river for the crocodiles to eat.
Number 5. Horus and Set. Speaking of Horus, earlier, remember how I said Horus had to take over defending his father? Well, here is where this story begins. When Horus grew up to be a man, he pulled a Hamlet. He was like, "You killed my father, prepare to die." Thus a series of battles ensued, and one of the gods didn't play fair. Set kept cheating at everything and continued to come out as victor. Not surprising, since he didn't earn his way on the throne, he killed for it, kind of like a certain Claudius. Eventually Isis stepped up to help her son/nephew overcome her brother. She set a trap for Set, but after some pitiless begging for his own life, she let him go. Horus was pissed, so angry some of the other gods got upset that he was so angry. They agreed to compete in a final boat race, and Horus was like crushing it. He was doing really well, he was about to win, but then of course Set cheated by turning into a hippopotamus and attacked the boat, therefore claiming victory once again. Osiris finally showed up and declared that no man should take the throne through murder. So Horus took the throne. Why Osiris didn't just settle the whole deal from the beginning is confusing in itself, but hey, kinda reminded me of the eagles that showed at the end of Lord of the Rings that could have saved like 3 movies, you know? Kinda like that. Anyways, let's move on. Number 4, Ra and his boat. Ra is one of the most revered gods in Egyptian mythology, especially since he was the god of the sun. He was depicted as a man with the head of a falcon. That kind of makes sense. He was once the greatest of all gods, but had to take a step back after he got too old and tired, and especially considering his task, I can see why. His job was to drive away darkness and sail across the skies, delivering light wherever he went. But at night, he would dive into the underworld and have to cross 12 gates. 12 hours, an hour per gate. After paying his respect to Osiris, every night, a giant snake named Hippopus tried to attack and swallow the boat. Every night! Poor guy, no wonder he got worn out. Every day it got harder to defend, and even one night, Hippopus succeeded, but could only hold the sunlight for so long. She threw it up, which explained solar eclipses. After Set was cast out after the whole nephew battle, he ended up serving Ra in his boat and kept the snake at bay, but there's something confusing coming later that I think you'll agree is very confusing, so here we go. Coming up next, we have Bast, number 3. Have you ever had a cat look you up and down and kind of like expect something, like worship? You know? Are you a cat person? Dog person? Let me know in the comments. Well, that's because cats were a big deal in Egyptian mythology. They even had their own goddess. Bastet was a cat goddess depicted as a woman with a cat's head. Cats had a meaningful role in ancient Egypt as they protected their food from rats and snakes. They were even seen as family members, and to harm one was punishable by death. Legend says that sometimes cats would enter burning buildings to save their families. If they died, the goddess would bring them back to life, hence the idea of cats having 9 lives. There it is. Now here's where things get confusing. You know that story I told about Ra? Well, apparently Bastet was in the boat with him as well. During the day she would ride with him, and at night she would turn into a cat and then defend the boat from Hippopus the snake. But I thought that was Set. So many conflicting things. I saw like a couple different stories who said each thing was different, so who knows. Number 2, Jeb and Nut. Yet another sibling partnership. We have Jeb and Nut. They fell deeply in love and could never be separated. They were that couple who would like constantly be like, oh my god, stop, right next to each other at dinner, you know what I mean? Jeb was the god of the earth and Nut was the god of the sky. A previously mentioned god, Tum, found their union inappropriate, so he pushed Nut into the sky far away from Jeb. He just didn't like being a third wheel. Jeb and Nut were close enough to see each other, but could never hold each other again. And she gave birth to Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. Some say Horus too, but I don't think that's true. Number 1, the treasure thief. Okay, I don't know how I feel about this story, okay? This doesn't really feel like harmony is in balance, but anyways. The treasure thief ends in a way I really didn't expect and I'm not sure you will either. Long ago, a great pharaoh with a wealth of riches decided to build a pyramid in which to keep them safe. One of the builders was wise to his plan and decided to find a way to claim them for himself. He built a stone vault with a hidden entrance covered by a slab so he could get to the riches. But unfortunately, he fell ill before he could return, so he told his sons of his plan. The sons headed to the pyramid in the dead of night, following their father's order. But, unbeknownst to them, the pharaoh had laid booby traps and one brother was caught in one. Not wanting to be found or interrogated, revealing his other brother, he told his brother to chop his head off. Ugh, that he did. Loyalty? I don't know. The pharaoh, upon finding the body, hung it up in the town square in the hopes of like weeding out whoever's it belonged to. But the other brother, being so clever, got the guards drunk and stole back his brother's body in the dead of night. The pharaoh was like, I'm not even mad, I'm just impressed. He gave the thief a pardon, summoned him to the square, and gave his daughter to marry him.
Number 10, false doors. Okay, right off the bat, imagine searching for a lost Egyptian tomb, alright? Imagine you've spent years of your life dedicating to this research and then you find a door. You find an entrance carved into the wall and this is it. What lies beyond? It's time. You try and carefully open it with a team of archaeologists, but it won't budge because it's a fake door. It's a false door. Yeah, just a Looney Tunes door. Somebody juked you out 4,500 years ago. Gotcha. Their spirit's been waiting that long to be like, nice, idiot. Alright, we can go home. We're good. False doors in Egyptian tombs were quite common in ancient Egyptian times. But if we look elsewhere throughout history, we find false doors in ancient Rome, in both tombs and the interior of homes, so that ought to be confusing for any house guests back then. It's also important to note that Egyptian culture was influenced by Mesopotamian architecture, so we've had fake doors around for a while now. A lot of confusing people for thousands of years. Ancient Egyptians believed that these false doors were a connection to the dead, and that spirits were able to travel here and there throughout living and death. Most false doors can be found on the West Wall because Egyptians believed the West to be the land of the dead. Number 9, the tomb of User. Back in March 2010, the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities released this photo. This 6-foot-tall slab of pink granite was carved over 3,500 years ago, and this door was found near Karnak Temple in Luxor, and originally it belonged to the chief minister of Queen Hatshepsut back in the 15th century. Now, User was a high-ranking official and held the position of vizier for 20 years at that time, so in turn, he got his own fancy tomb located on the west bank of the Nile. Remember, Egyptians associate the West with the land of the dead. That's going to come in quite a few times in this video. The actual slab of granite, this door, was found far away from its home. It had been moved thousands of years later and ended up in an ancient Roman era building. Never thought I'd have to say this, but don't steal doors from the dead. Got it? Okay, let's move on. Number 8, Alexandria Black Tomb. What if we found a tomb and then just opened it, you know? What if we found a mysterious black granite tomb in Alexandria, say back in 2018? Do you think it would be wise to just open it because we're curious? Spoiler alert, we opened it and it was exactly what we thought it was going to be. When archaeologists found this massive tomb untouched for over thousands of years, on one hand, yeah, that's a feat in itself, but us humans, we're curious creatures. We just gotta just a little peek just to see who's in there. I mean, after all, it could be Alexander the Great, right? That's the whole point of all this. Egyptian news outlet El Watan reported that the tomb was lifted only a few centimeters before every official involved at that construction site just fled the scene. They straight up just ran away. It smelled that bad. Mustafa Waziri, Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, this guy put his entire head in the tomb just to show us that it's safe. That's great. I mean, you could use your hand, maybe even a foot, I guess, just a little foot dip, but straight to the head dipping? Come on, Mr. Waziri, be smart about this. Number 7, Valley of the Kings. While March 2020 wasn't the best month of all time by any means, Egyptian officials did locate a secret vault hiding in the sands of the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. Just off the west bank of the Nile, the Valley of the Kings, as its name hints towards, is a pretty historical part of Egypt's past. Again, do we want to open this vault? Probably not, but did we? Yes. Bones and goo and history. What do you know? Surprise, surprise. Number 6, 2020 tombs. Summer 2020, nice. While most of us was stuck inside watching Netflix, more than 100 sealed coffins were found. And yes, they were occupied for the most part. Found, of course, in Saqqara, Egypt, Egyptian archaeologists have never been more excited. Maybe we'll find the body of Cleopatra. Wouldn't that just be dandy? The fact that we found over 100 of these still in great shape is mind-blowing. Grave robbers have been around since ancient Egyptian days, and for all of these to be untouched for this long is honestly unbelievable. These findings date back to 712 BC, which was a period where Egypt was controlled by foreign civilizations. That's what makes this so insane. Like Persians and Greeks, they were all around at this time. The idea that we're finding mummies is great and all, but again, do we need to open all of them up? Maybe there's treasure, maybe there's bodies. Either way, it's not yours. Am I insane? Maybe I'm insane. Do we need to find Alexander the Great this badly that we're willing to disrespect this many souls in the process?
Number 5, Xerxes I. You've most likely heard of this guy. If not from his historically inaccurate portrayal in 300, then at least from 1 or 2 history classes. But Adam, wasn't he the emperor of Persia? Yeah, well, guess what, my little bees? Egypt was part of the Persian Empire, which makes him pharaoh as well. This guy gets a pretty bad rap in history. But who wrote that history? The Greeks, who despised him for his attempted invasion of Greece. Oh, I'm not saying he was great or anything. In fact, he had a bit of a disregard for the traditions of the Egyptians and their way of life. But you cannot tell me that he was not significant in history. Xerxes the Great makes this list for his infamy more than anything else. Number 4, Akhenaten. So this is gonna be the second not so beloved pharaoh on this list. But disdain for Akhenaten didn't come from war, or the fact that his massive army was defeated by a group of a couple hundred Greeks. No, Akhenaten here was infamous for his devout following of a singular god, Aten, the god of the sun. He actually moved the capital of Egypt to a new location that he titled Akhetaten, or Horizon of Aten. And he kinda made everyone else worship the single god Aten as well. He was famous for a different reason though. Akhenaten was married to Nefertiti. She played a huge part in his religious plans, and she is well known in history for the limestone bust that was made of her, and has been copied so many freaking times. Number 3, Kufu. When you think of Egypt, there is likely one thing that pops straight into your mind. If you say anything other than the Great Pyramids of Giza, you do not pass go, you do not collect $200, and you lose. Kufu is the pharaoh you have to thank for this wonder of the ancient world. We still sorta don't know exactly how it was constructed, but this Goliath limestone and mud brick structure was the tallest building in the world for like 4,000 years. It was built as the housing for his tomb and as his stairway to heaven. No, not the Led Zeppelin song. It has 3 chambers inside of it plus a gallery that we've discovered so far. As for what else Kufu contributed to ancient Egyptian life, we don't have much in the way of texts about that yet. But if this is the main thing, then I mean, I'd take it. Number 2, Cleopatra. How could she not be on this list? She was the very last pharaoh Egypt ever had, and she was arguably one of the most famous ones. Not only becoming a figure in history, but a character in literature, theater, and media. Cleopatra VII was pharaoh in Egypt from 51 to 30 BC, and it was one hell of a reign. She introduced tons of reforms to improve the Egyptian economy. She was an awesome diplomat and a scholar. She didn't have things too easy though. Having to fight her own brother for the throne and having to do some diplomacy with various famous Romans. Things kind of fizzled out near the end, but she certainly ended the line of Egyptian pharaohs with a beloved bang, as was her style. Number 1, Ramses II. Alright, this one was definitely the one I thought of first. Ramses II is arguably the most famous of all the pharaohs. He reigned for 67 years. He had 96 children. He had a crazy successful military campaign conquering the Hittites, Syrians, and Nubians. No other pharaoh that we know of has been able to build like he has. He lived to the age of 90, which is insane for back then. And he professed himself a god, which I'm sure some people actually believed. Even today, when we moved his remains to France for restoration, he had to be given a passport that literally said "King, deceased," under the occupation. Truly an incredibly influential pharaoh. Okay bees, that's the list we've got for today.